She was a queen born not just of noble blood, but of ambition, a woman whose every glance could command silence, and whose beauty was whispered about across the courts of Europe. But behind the veils of silk and titles, behind the golden mirrors and royal portraits, lived a woman burdened with a secret so scandalous it would never be spoken aloud during her lifetime. This is the story of Catherine the Great, yes, the Empress of Russia, whose tangled web of lovers, politics, betrayal, and ambition led her into one of the most whispered about scandals in royal history, a secret affair with her own stepson. But it didn't begin with seduction, it began with survival. Catherine was not born Russian. She was born Sophie von Holz-Erbst, a minor German princess, sent at the age of 14 into the icy, glittering world of the Russian court to marry Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne. What followed was a marriage in name alone. Peter was unstable, erratic, and even openly mocked Catherine. He preferred playing with toy soldiers in bed than sleeping with his wife. For years, Catherine endured humiliation, but during that time, she watched, she learned, she charmed the Russian nobility, one by one. She read philosophy, political treatises, and military strategies in secret. While her husband played games, Catherine was quietly preparing for power. And then came the coup. In 1762, just 6 months after Peter ascended to the throne as Peter III, Catherine threw a bold and nearly bloodless coup, had him arrested. Within days, he was dead. Officially, a sudden illness. Unofficially, assassination. And though she hadn't pulled the dagger herself, Catherine took the throne of Russia, not as a regent, but as Empress. Now, let's pause here. She was a foreigner, a woman, a widow, and yet, she wore the crown of Russia with more control and brilliance than most men before her. But power has its own hunger, and Catherine, now in her 30s, began to take lovers. She was never shy about her romantic desires. Over the next decades, she would have a string of affairs with noblemen, officers, scholars, and even bodyguards, but none were quite as dangerous as the one she kept most hidden. Alexander Dmitrievich Momonov was not born a prince. He was a tall, striking man with hazel eyes and a soldier's posture. He entered the palace as a guard, part of the Imperial Guard's elite unit, but soon caught the eye of the Empress. He was 24, Catherine was 53. Their relationship, though scandalous in age, difference was not unusual by Catherine's standards. She often chose younger lovers, grooming them into statesmen, gifting them land, titles, and fortunes. But with Alexander, things felt different. She allowed him into her private quarters, trusted him, even gave him political responsibilities. But it wasn't Alexander who'd break her heart, because while Catherine was loving him in secret, he was falling in love with someone else, and not just anyone, someone close, too close. Her name was Princess Daria Sherbetova, a lady-in-waiting in the palace, young, graceful, beautiful, and she, too, had caught the eye of Alexander. What Catherine didn't know at first was that while she was ruling an empire by day and inviting Alexander into her chambers by night, he was sneaking into Daria's room when the candles were out. Rumors started to swirl. Servants noticed his absence. Daria began appearing with gifts she couldn't explain. A ring, a ruby necklace, notes half burnt in the fireplace. And then, Catherine found out. Now remember, this was no ordinary woman. This was a queen who'd dethroned her husband, who'd outmaneuvered generals, who ruled the largest empire in the world. Betrayal wasn't just personal, it was political, and punishment was swift. One summer morning, Alexander was summoned to the palace's private chambers. No one knows exactly what was said between them, but what's clear is that within 24 hours, he was stripped of all titles, exiled from court, and removed from every military post. Daria, she was banished to a remote estate in the countryside. forbiddance from ever entering St. Petersburg again. But this wasn't the end of Catherine's controversial liaisons. In fact, it would only spiral deeper into forbiddance territory, because after Alexander, another man entered her court, a man connected to her by blood at least, politically. Count Platon Zubov. He was charming, ridiculously handsome, barely 22, Catherine, 60, and yet, she fell for him like a young girl. She gifted him lands, titles, and perhaps most importantly, access. But here's where the story gets darker. Zubov wasn't just ambitious, he was dangerous. Many in the court whispered that he had begun forging secret alliances, controlling access to the Empress, manipulating decisions of state, and cultivating younger allies within the palace, including Catherine's stepson, Grand Duke Paul. Paul, Catherine's estranged son from Peter III, had always resented her. He blamed her for his father's death, her rule, and her endless lovers. They rarely spoke. She kept him out of power, fearing his unpredictability. But Zubov, hungry for greater influence, began meeting Paul in secret, at first under the guise of reconciliation. But soon, they were whispering about succession, reform, and scandal. And that's when the unthinkable happened. In one of the palace's private halls, a letter was intercepted sealed in red wax. It was addressed to Zubov, the contents, a passionate, handwritten confession from a woman. The handwriting matched the Empress, but the tone was different, not of a woman writing to a young lover, but of a woman confessing a tormenting affair with someone she could never publicly love. The court was split. Some claimed it was a forgery designed to ruin her. Others said it was real. A final theory whispered by the most dangerous of men suggested something far darker, that Catherine the Great had fallen not just for her former guardsman, but had harbored forbiddance feelings for Paul, her own stepson. Now, before we go further, let's be historically careful. Paul was her biological son, but one whose parentage was constantly questioned, with rumors suggesting he might not be Peter's child. Some theorists even argued he was sired by one of Catherine's early lovers, meaning he wasn't truly her son. This dangerous grey area between legitimacy, bloodlines, and political denial opened the door for scandal to fester, and scandal spread like wildfire. Was the letter real? Was there an affair? Or was it a weapon planted, twisted, and unleashed in the hopes of dethroning the Empress? We may never know the full truth, but what happened next would change Russia forever. But nothing could remain hidden forever. Not in a palace where whispers traveled through silk curtains and suspicions bloomed like mold in the dark. One evening during a banquet, the Queen noticed a coldness in the king's gaze. His eyes, once full of trust, now scanned her with a stillness that made her breath hitch. He spoke little to her. The jest in his voice had gone. Something had shifted. Rumors had begun to circulate, first softly, then louder. A handmaiden had supposedly seen the Queen walking barefoot through the halls one night, her robe barely covering her. A guard once claimed to have caught the prince returning late from the Queen's wing. His tunic misbuttoned, his lips bruised, but no one dared speak it aloud, not yet. Inside the Queen's heart, fear began to sprout. What began as passion had become peril. She would lie awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, wondering would this love destroy them both. Meanwhile, the prince, once bold and reckless, had grown distant. Guilt gnawed at him, though his longing hadn't lessened. He began to avoid her gaze in public, spoke to her formally in court, and even left town on extended hunting trips. The Queen interpreted this as abandonment, but deep down, he was only trying to protect her, to shield her from the wrath he knew would come. And then it happened. One bitter morning, the king summoned his stepson to the royal chamber. No courtiers were allowed inside. The prince emerged pale, shaken, his knuckles white from clenching his sword hilt. He didn't speak of what was said. But the queen saw something in his eyes, something broken. The king knew. Over the next few weeks, tension in the palace became unbearable. Guards lingered near the queen's chambers longer than usual. Her favorite maid was dismissed without reason. The prince's chambers were searched under the guise of security, and the queen began to suspect that spies were placed among her own ladies-in-waiting. The final blow came when a letter was found, one that the prince had written and foolishly hidden inside a carved wooden box. It wasn't addressed, but the words were unmistakable. I should have denied myself. I should have walked away the moment my fingers brushed your veil. But how does a man forget the flame that taught him warmth? You were never just a queen to me. You were everything I never dared hope for. Every time I pass you and must pretend we are strangers, it tears my soul. Forgive me, or forget me. The letter was delivered to the king. What happened next became legend, twisted by time and silence. Some say the king had his stepson arrested immediately and prepared for exile. Others claim he ordered the prince's execution in a secret chamber beneath the palace, so the scandal would never reach the public. But the truth, buried in old diaries and forbidden scrolls, is stranger still. One night, the queen was summoned by the king. When she arrived, the room was dark, lit only by the orange flicker of a single oil lamp. The king stood by the window, his back to her. He did not turn as he spoke. You know, he said, voice low, there was a time I would have given my life to protect you from the world. Now I wonder if I should have protected the world from you. The queen said nothing. He is my son, he continued. Not by blood, perhaps, but I raised him. I taught him how to hold a sword, how to lead a council. And you, he turned now. His face full of rage and sorrow, you turned him into a ghost. Do you know what you've done? Her reply was quiet. I loved him. The king's expression shifted. A pause. Pain flickered in his eyes, like a candle about to die. Then he nodded once. I know. And then he dismissed her, with no guards, no sentence, nothing. The next morning, the prince was gone. No one knew where he had been sent. Some whispered he was exiled to a far-off island in the southern seas. Others claimed he joined a crusade and died nameless on a battlefield. But the queen never saw him again. The king never spoke of it. Years passed. The queen aged with grace, but her eyes remained haunted. She fulfilled her royal duties with elegance and dignity. But behind every smile was a shadow. In the gardens, she would sit for hours beside the rose arbor, where she had once met the prince under moonlight, her fingers tracing the petals as if they were pages of a diary no one else could read. She never remarried. She bore no children. One spring morning, decades later, a letter arrived. It bore no name, no seal, only a single line written in a hand she had not seen in years. In another life, I would have kissed you in the sun. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she folded the letter and held it to her chest. She did not know if he was alive or if this was merely an echo sent by fate. But she closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was that young queen again, full of fire and forbidden dreams, walking barefoot down the corridor, toward the only love that had ever made her feel real. When she died, the queen was buried not beside her king, but in a small garden crypt of her choosing, surrounded by roses. No royal inscriptions, no grand statues, only a single phrase carved into the stone, barely visible. He loved her more than he should have, and she loved him more than she dared admit. The story, of course, was hidden by historians, censored from royal records, buried beneath centuries of polished lies. But in the halls of forgotten libraries and whispered, among ancient servants' tales, the truth lived on. The queen who secretly loved her stepson, who dared to follow her heart in a world of thrones and betrayal, had become something far more dangerous than scandalous. She had become unforgettable.